Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Why don't we get started? I want to welcome you to the Woodrow Wilson Center. My name is Jeff DeBelco. I'm fortunate enough to direct our Environmental Change and Security Program, and we're thrilled to be collaborating with OSD Policy today and Amanda Dory's shop on a program that we're calling Climate Change and Energy in Defense Doctrine, the QDR and UK Defense Green Paper. And on behalf of my boss, former Congressman Lee Hamilton, the President Director of the Wilson Center, it's really terrific for us to have this conversation because in our conversations about formulating this meeting, it was about an opportunity for the folks who are working on the climate and energy issues within Defense Doctrine and obviously QDR, and we'll hear from Admiral Morisetti about the UK Green Paper, the Defense Green Paper, to have a conversation with a number of the people, the experts in this area that they consulted with, the expert input that got us to where we are and were, I think, key inputs as they understood it to where we have arrived, and then particularly engage in a dialogue for where we're going to go from here. And so we are thrilled at the Environmental Change and Security Program to be hosting this discussion. We started in 1994 looking at these environment security issues together with many of you in the audience. I see some of our very first participants from those early days over in the Smithsonian Castle. Climate change was not the front burner issue as it is today, the way into these larger conversations. But I think many of the issues that have been identified in these reports that all of us are grappling with are some of the same ones, and understanding how climate change and energy issues come down and intersect and interplay with those issues as both threats, obviously, but also in some instances as opportunities. And so that is what we're here to discuss today in a dialogue that I know we certainly look forward to, and we appreciate all of you making your time available for this conversation. I'm going to be very quick with the introduction so that we can go straight to the panel. We're going to start with Amanda Dory, who, as you know, is a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense in the policy shop for strategy. Amanda, as you also know, is a key figure in this QDR on a variety of issues, including the climate and energy ones. And so it's terrific, Amanda, that you'll share your thoughts with us on how you've come to this process and what we have and how we go forward. Rear Admiral Neil Morisetti is the Climate Energy Security Envoy for the Ministry of Defense and the Foreign Commonwealth Office in the UK. I think, as many of you know, this meeting is actually rescheduled. We tried, and it didn't work the first time around. And in some ways, mercifully, that snowstorm means that he's able to join us. And so we count that blessing from that awful storm, that Admiral Morisetti is able to join us. He, as you know, is the lead for the UK on this. And I think since we have so many people expert on these issues, he and his colleagues at the embassy are really no strangers to all of us because they've been active participants in the discussion here, as well as leaders in the European context and the UK context. So it's terrific that he can tell us about how these issues are evolving in their defense doctrine. And then Commander Esther McClure and Marine Lieutenant Colonel Paul Schimpf are the ones who came out and talked with so many of you in preparing this. They are energy and environmental strategy analysts in the Office of Secretary of Defense in the policy shop and Amanda's strategy shop. And I, like many of you, had the good fortune to engage in some long conversations on a whole host of very challenging questions that they've investigated. Both have distinguished careers, obviously, and you can see for all four of our speakers in the handout. I won't go through the long list for the sake of time, and I think I will turn it straight over to Amanda. So please, the floor is yours.
Can you hear me okay in the back? Great. Well, good afternoon, and I have to say I've been on the speaking circuit a fair amount in the last couple of weeks since the QDR came out, and I think this is the event that I've been looking forward to the most out of a variety of international and DC-based engagements, because it feels today like there's a true community of interest here in the room, a community that helped us so much in the work that we did to prepare for the QDR, and this is our attempt to kind of give back in a sense to let you know what it was that we heard from you, to talk about what we were able to include within the report itself, and then most importantly to talk about implementation moving ahead. I have a couple of thanks that I want to issue. First of all, to the Wilson Center and to Jeff for hosting us, but above and beyond the venue, which is important, really for your leadership over time, as you highlight, going back to 1994, having worked this issue set for quite a long time, before it was hot, as you said, and you had done a lot of the intellectual spade work that Department of Defense was able to take advantage of in the work that we did. And I know there are many others in similar institutions within this room, but just to really salute those efforts that helped us in terms of collecting intellectual capital to support the work that we did. And just that very important research function that you play, and also the track 1.5 and track 2 type events that you and others in this room host. They're so important to us, and I just truly appreciate your efforts in that regard. I'd also like to thank Neil, who I've met in the course of the last year and shared a podium with on several occasions, or shared a panel with, I guess that would be the way to describe it. But for the insights that we were able to derive from the UK and from other allies in this regard, we certainly see the evolution of thinking in other defense establishments on this issue set, and I think it's really exemplified by having Neil here today. I'd also like to thank EJ and Paul, who, as you heard and as many of you know, were really the core of the environment, climate, and energy work within the QDR. And they're not just the core, they're the heart and soul of it, and they're also the brains of it. And they're going to have the opportunity to talk a little bit in more detail about the methodology that underpinned the work that we did within the QDR, and I would just salute their efforts. So thank you, collective thank you to many of you. What I'd like to do in my remarks is give you a sense. I'm going to make the assumption that everybody has read the section within the QDR that talks about climate and energy, and if you haven't, you can ask me about it in the Q&A, but I want to situate it within the broader context of the QDRs to understand the treatment, because if you just flip to that one section and miss out on the broader context, I think it would give an inaccurate depiction of where the department is writ large. So just a few slides included in here. Let's see if this works. There we go. We have a set of slides that we use for all of our briefings to congressional staff, and I think there may be some in here today who recognize these. But again, this is the QDR writ large. I'd like to use those, talk to them briefly, and then hone in on the particular climate and energy pieces. To the extent that the QDR had to have a bumper sticker of some sort, we wanted it to be this concept that you see in the very first bullet, this idea of rebalancing military capabilities within the United States and reforming our defense processes and institutions. And we're rebalancing and reforming not just because that's a good thing to do, but we're doing it towards 4 particular ends or strategic priorities. And those are the 4 subticks that you see. The idea of prevailing in our current conflicts today, the idea of preventing and deterring any additional conflict, the third tenet being to prepare to defeat adversaries and succeed in a broader range of contingencies than the department has historically focused on. So moving beyond the idea of large conventional set-piece conflicts and recognizing that there's a much broader variety in terms of the challenge space in the future that we see. And the last strategic tenet, this idea of preserving and enhancing the all-volunteer force. This is the first QDR that raised that tenet to the level of a strategic priority within the department, that we rely upon the soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marine, the civilians, the contractors that pull together and support the defense institution, and that their preservation is critical to the department's success. I just say briefly, and among these 4 priorities, the other thing that the QDR does is explicitly talk about where we're taking risk, because we can't do everything at equal levels. And so Secretary Gates was very explicit that the top priority is prevailing or succeeding in the conflicts we find ourselves in today, the global campaign against Al-Qaeda and the conflicts in Afghanistan and as we achieve success in Iraq. Those are our top priorities. And that means that we're taking a certain amount of risk in the other three strategic elements, and we can talk about that more in the Q&A, but we're not doing as much in the prevention and deterrence arena as we might like. In terms of preparing to defeat adversaries in a broader range of contingencies, we're certainly making advances in that regard, but would wish to do more. And finally, for preserving and enhancing the all-volunteer force, we're certainly taking risks today as far as the tempo with which the force is being used. And there's a fair amount of attention within the QDR to this idea of needing to reset the force as we draw down out of Iraq and get to a more sustainable operational tempo. So just, I want to share this with you to understand the context in which we start to talk about the reform that relates to climate and energy. That works. On the approach, I won't dwell on the strategy-driven aspect. There are certain audiences that want to dwell in detail on here. Again, we can come back to it. The issue in terms of our approach with unprecedented engagement and consultation, I think this audience represents an element of that, as far as we did reach out in a very significant way to a variety of interagency partners, regularly consulted with congressional staffs, the international dimension, and outside defense experts. So I think this group probably doesn't need any convincing in that regard. The security environment, very important part of the strategy development process. This is saying what do we see out there in the future. We certainly are very humble about our ability to predict the future, but given the various inputs that we're able to receive from the intelligence community, from external experts, from our own thinking, the plausible, there's a range of futures, but what is that most plausible future? And in the future that we see, you see the enduring trends listed here, the rise of new powers. These are powers like China, like India, like Brazil, the return of Russia to the world scene. You can go on. There's a list of other new powers, but there are significant players on the international scene. The growth of non-state actors and their role in the security environment. The spread of dangerous technologies, and we're particularly concerned here about weapons of mass destruction and ballistic missiles in particular. And then resource scarcity, and then here you see climate change, disease, demographics. These we all see to be enduring trends that impact on the security environment in the future. And then the kind of so what factor for the Department of Defense, what does that mean in terms of the operational landscape? And you see some of those key insights that follow. This idea of multidimensional conflicts that are a challenging mix of, if you think of a spectrum of conflict, some refer to low end and high end, which I think is a little misleading, but this idea that conflicts will have irregular dimensions to them, they will have high end or asymmetric dimensions to them, and coupled in very challenging ways. Our potential adversaries are not, intending to fight the last war that we've fought. They learn from that as we learn from them, and they are adapting and they're innovating, and we have to do the same. Threats to the global commons. This was a theme within the QDR. In the emphasis, I think, was more significant this time, given the encroachments that we've seen in the different parts of the global commons, whether it's the maritime commons, the piracy threat that has manifested more recently, the cyber and the space commons. Certain events and causes for concern in all of those domains give us the sense that we can't take for granted the concept that the global commons are available to all, and that the United States' role in defending and preserving those global commons over time. We believe that is something that will become increasingly challenging in the future, and that we have to work on with allies, with partners, with the rest of the international community. Good, okay. Oh, I can hear myself really loudly now. The third operational landscape issue that I would bring to your attention, this idea of anti-access and area denial capabilities. This is the antidote, in a sense, to the U.S. ability to project power that has been largely unchallenged for decades now. But potential adversaries are developing very challenging capabilities that we now have to contend with, and we refer to them in total as anti-access area denial capabilities. Very significant challenge for the department, in this QDR, you see a lot of attention on that. And last and not least, this idea of fragile states. And these are states that are potentially the most vulnerable ones to changes in climate over time. And our sense is that there will be increasing calls for support to states that are facing challenges, whether they're induced by climate change or by other factors, but that state weakness will be as much of a part of the future security environment as state strength. Just two more from our overarching QDR briefing, and on achieving our objectives, this is really the ways that we see doing things, and these are both very relevant to our specific topic today. This idea of strengthening relationships at home and abroad, the collaboration with allies and partners, and with the idea of the civilian tool set where the Department of Defense has a role to play, but often in support of others. These are both relevant to the climate and energy issue areas. And then the most significant treatment within the QDR document on those issues, there's the treatment in the security environment, but really came into reforming how we do business, and it was one of 5 areas described there. I won't go into the top 4 that have much to do with the relationship either with the private sector in the case of defense industry or with other agency partners in Congress in the areas of security assistance and export control reform. But it's really that final one that I now want to dig into in more detail, but this idea of enterprise-wide approaches to climate change and energy. So going into some work that we've tailored more to the opportunity today, I think as many of you know, this was the first quadrennial defense review that treated climate change by direction, by legislation. So it's the 4th time that the department has done a quadrennial defense review, but it was the first time that the legislation had been amended to direct us to look at the impact of climate change on the department's roles and missions and installations. And that was thanks in part to the groundbreaking work that CNA had done and their work up on the Hill, and the actual provision thanks to now Secretary Clinton, then Senator Clinton, and Senator Warner. So that gave the demand signal to the department to look at this issue explicitly for the first time. The main body of the findings are included in the part of the report that talks to how we do business. The third tick is referring to the legislation directed us to look at climate change, but we felt that we had to look simultaneously at energy and the department's role as an energy consumer and as an energy protector, and understanding the linkage, the economic linkage among all 3 of those. The 4th bullet is referring to the idea that we have begun now to incorporate climate and energy considerations into the full range of the department's strategic planning processes, and I'll say a little bit more about that as we go on. The other thing I would say is that the department doesn't have a office of climate research with a deep scientific background to rely on. What we did was rely on the expertise of others in this regard. So we made use of the work of the Global Change Research Program, that's the multi-agency consortium, as well as the groundbreaking work that the DNI had done and their initial national intelligence assessment on national security implications of global climate change. So those were very important inputs into our work. Starting first with the energy topic, and this is just a brief resume of what is in the report itself. But our findings, we looked at the role of energy and reaffirmed what I think everybody in this room knows or knew, but this idea that the energy is both a potential vulnerability and an asymmetric vulnerability at that for the department. It can play that role. At the same time, it can be a force multiplier when you look at the possible gains through energy efficiency that can come in terms of the logistics associated with energy consumption within the department, particularly operational deployed energy, and the opportunities to reduce manpower associated with logistics and delivery of energy supplies to deployed forces, also associated with endurance times, for example, for platforms that become more energy efficient. That there are real wins available, and so the force multiplier terminology is something that really resonates within the department. This idea, the second bullet, speaks to a strategy for what we're calling assured energy or energy security within the department to have the energy supplies that are needed, whether it's here in the United States or overseas, at the times that they're needed for operational needs. But the department's needs, of course, will have to nest within a broader national energy security strategy. And that work is now underway at an interagency level, and the department's strategy will need to nest within that. This third tick, again, something I think many of us in this room have championed, but this idea of a position, a Senate confirmed position that will create a director of operational energy plans and programs within the department for the first time. As many of you know, there is already an official who looks at installations energy within our acquisition technology and logistics component, but this will create the counterpart for the operational energy side. This is a position where a nomination has been made within this administration, and we're hoping will be confirmed and filled quite soon, and there's an acting official in place at the present time. The fourth bullet has to do, again, with this idea of bringing energy consideration into our force planning processes and requirements development and acquisition processes. So that's really setting the demand signal as far as future acquisitions, ensuring that energy is fully considered, and many of you are familiar with the idea of key performance parameters and energy's inclusion now as one of the key performance parameters. Another associated initiative that has to do with using the fully burdened cost of fuel when we do those types of costing projections within the department, so that the complete costing and realistic costing is included in our planning and projections. I mentioned installations already. At the installation level, there are many opportunities to increase the use of renewable energy supplies and reduce energy demand, and a lot of this work is already in motion. You're likely quite familiar with the innovative work that's happening in each of the services at installations around the United States. Multi-benefits coming out of that. That's being directed. The QDR did not create new metrics in that regard. We've had some questions along the way about why there weren't new metrics. The response to that is we have goals and metrics that have been set through both legislation and through executive orders that will challenge the department for a good while to come. So we did not set additional levels within the QDR document. The second tick refers to the idea of resiliency of the energy infrastructure, and this is talking in particular about the grid within the United States and the vulnerabilities to the grid. This is something that has been highlighted in prior work by a Defense Science Board, and that's something that the department has to work to ensure access to energy supplies for mission critical areas, but do so with an understanding of the broader context of the communities in which these installations are based. And last but not least, this idea of prioritizing our research and development. And this is happening already within the services as far as reducing vulnerabilities for our forward operating bases and for our deployed forces. Shifting to climate change, again, we looked at climate change explicitly for the first time during this QDR and noted that climate change, we used the language that was pioneered by CNA, but this idea of an instability accelerant. We did not say that climate change is a threat to national security. We see climate change as a condition that has second order effects that can contribute to conflict and instability. Climate change itself is not directly a threat to national security in the formulation that we used within the QDR. It certainly shapes our operating environment, and we explained our findings as far as the impact on our roles and missions as well. The second tick refers to the idea that the Department of Defense is not the U.S. government lead for climate change, but we certainly can show leadership in this area, and that's true for energy as well. And we have been engaging with interagency partners, whether it's the State Department and the support that we provided in their efforts in Copenhagen, for example, engagement with the Department of Energy in the energy arena. And that is something that we're committed to going forward. we identify there are lots of challenges when you look at climate change. We identified some opportunities as well, and it's the case in many instances where, in light of a significant challenge, there are those opportunities to pull together, whether it's within the interagency context or internationally, to problem solve in a way that you don't when problems are less pressing. Trends and challenges, in this expert audience, I will not dwell here, but you have first order effects that we anticipate from climate change and already see today, and then cascading effects that start to impact on the security environment, whether it's competition for food or land or water, impacts on agricultural productivity, and then challenges to governments. And then referring back to the discussion earlier of weak states, there are many states that are really unable to cope effectively with the challenges that climate change will pose. As far as the way ahead, and I think this is where I'm hoping we'll have a lot of conversation today, what will we do? We have what we have within the document, and what will we do to institutionalize and implement going forward? The first piece of that really has to do with the normal departmental processes, the guidance processes, and then our planning and budgeting processes. And so the findings from the QDR are then incorporated into those. Some of those have to do with guidance that's provided to our combatant commands as far as their security cooperation activities and priorities going forward. That will be one place where we have the opportunity to raise attention on the issues associated with climate change and energy. Another has to do with guidance and communications that go to the services for longer-term capabilities development. And then within our annual programming, planning, budgeting processes, PPBE. So that's and we can talk about those in more detail, but that's the first kind of wave of implementation beyond the QDR. The second has to do with work underway, and I referenced already as far as the challenging energy targets that we have already coming from executive orders and legislation, and that work will continue going ahead. But as we're doing that work, the innovation that comes from some of the solutions that are being developed at the installations level, we do have opportunities to share those out into the civilian community and vice versa. A third important step, and you'll hear more about this from EJ and Paul, but we took the opportunity as part of our QDR work to do an initial installations vulnerability assessment, and we did it very quickly and at a not in detail, and we will go back to that work and begin the hard work of assessing on an installation by installation basis which of the existing installations within the United States and our installations overseas are vulnerable to what types of climate change, and then how will we develop the integrated adaptation plans with local communities and at all those different installations. The fourth bullet, the integration into force planning analysis, I referred to that previously, but there are different ways that we'll do that within the department. We in our force planning work, we spend a lot of time working on scenarios that are future-oriented that we use then to develop insights about what future capabilities are needed and then what is the capacity, how much do we need of particular capabilities. And so we will be weaving our findings on energy vulnerabilities, for example, and on the types of situations that can be created as a result of climate change. Those will be woven into the scenarios that we use for force planning work, and then we'll have cascading impacts within the analysis that happens within the department. The last two bullets really refer to opportunities that we see as we endeavor to focus on where we need to mitigate and where adaptation needs to begin. But there are opportunities in the R&D arena. Those exist and will be ramped up. The scientific data sharing, the department participates in those types of opportunities with other agencies already. For adaptation, we see two important threads here moving forward, which really has to do with the military-to-military engagement that the department does on a regular basis with countries around the world. And some of them are already leaning into discussions in this area, and as exemplified by Neil Morisetti here today. And in other places, it's really a consciousness an awareness kind of opportunity to talk about the future security environment and to raise awareness of the types of challenges that will unfold, and then to share the lessons that the department has developed already in a variety of areas, whether it's in the operational energy arena and where we've been able to make efficiencies and how we've learned about that, whether it's at the installations level. So we do see moving forward the opportunities in our security cooperation to engage on those issues. And we've begun the work with other agencies, AID, with the Department of Energy, with State Department, to understand where their international cooperative efforts are already focused, and where we'll be able to find points of harmony between the authorities and resources the department has relative to those of other agencies. I think I'll stop there for now to make sure to leave time for everybody else. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Admiral, why don't we turn the floor directly over to you?
Maybe close this down. Escape. It's a good word, isn't it? Minimize that. Okay.
Was this you, Rita?
Yeah, I just want to. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for inviting me to come along. Jeff, I'm very grateful for the second invitation. I think I probably would have enjoyed the tobogganing the first time, but it was very kind of you to rearrange this. Can I also take this opportunity to thank, on behalf of both the Ministry of Defence and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, Amanda, EJ and Paul for the support they've given us as we start this process. I know that EJ is moving on. All I would ask is that your successor has the same telephone number, because we're going to be back. You won't be surprised to hear that there are remarkable similarities in the approach between our two countries. Not just because we spent a lot of time talking, but also because those are there. There are also some subtle differences which reflect our national perspectives. And what I would like to do is to try and outline both of those bits. Where we are most certainly in agreement, though, is that the security implications of climate change and the associated security of energy supplies are potential threats to our national security. And what's more, it's an area which we don't really know that much about. We know enough to know we've got to do something, but our level of understanding isn't as great as we would like. You've heard from Amanda how you've addressed it in America. What I thought I would do is talk about how we've done it in the UK. But beforehand, it's probably worth putting it into context as to where we are. We may feel, having produced a green paper, we've done a defence review, but we haven't even started yet. Unlike your QDR cycle, we don't have regular defence reviews. Although, watch this space, it may change. We have them after changes of government or major events. So we had one in 1997, 1998, when the Labour Party came to power, and we reviewed that after 9/11 in our new chapter. We are due to have an election sometime before June. Who's going to win is anybody's guess. But the money is the 6th of May of when it's going to happen, but there or thereabouts. And both political parties have indicated that shortly after that election, there will be a defence review. One talks of a defence review, another talks about a security and defence review. But whatever happens, we're going to see something soon after that. And as a precursor to that, we spent the last 9 months producing what we call a green paper. If only a defence review was that thin. This has been out to 4 times this size while we've been doing the work on that. And what it does is it sets the context. As it says, it sets the issues that we will need to discuss in a defence review. And at the same time, our Defence Concepts and Doctrine Centre has produced a document called Global Strategic Trends. It's the 4th time they've done it. They do it about every 4 years. And this one goes out to 2040. And it provides a meat and flesh on the bone. So out at the front, you've got highlights of both the green paper and this. I'm afraid you have to read both to get the context from the UK. So what do they say about climate change, climate security, and energy security? Well, the green paper talks about 5 major trends that will impact on the international context. and defence in the coming decades. You will recognise broadly the same as what Amanda's talked about, different words, but the same piece. The rise of the Asia-Pacific region, globalisation, growing inequality, proliferation, and climate change. And on climate change, and I'll read, we will see serious climate change whose impact is likely to be most severe where it coincides with other stresses such as poverty, demographic growth, and resource shortages. All 5 of those trends are likely to result in increased international instability and will pose challenges to our interests. Now, as I said, the concepts document takes that work and expands on it. You've got the pages. I'll just highlight 1 or 2 of the key points. They identify climate change as one of the key 4 drivers of change, what they call a ring road issue, one that pervades all our activity that we go about. And there is overwhelming evidence that the global atmosphere will continue to warm at an unprecedented rate throughout the 21st century. It will amplify existing social, political, and resource stresses, shifting a tipping point at which conflict ignites, rather than directly causing it. Again, similar to what we've heard from America. The frequency and intensity of extreme weather events will increase. That will threaten people, particularly in the littoral. When you have a debate with people about whether the humans have any impact on climate change or whether it's just a natural cycle, this key point, last time we had a cycle, we didn't have 6.8 billion people on the planet, and most of them weren't living in the littoral, and that's where we're going to see the effect. It's going to dominate the global political agenda, especially in the developed world, where it represents an increasingly important single issue. The second and third order consequences on the UK of climate change and its consequent tension overseas are not well understood, as I said earlier. And weak states will have a limited capacity for governance, and many are unlikely to be able to adapt to the environmental changes that will come with climate change. Now, on energy, it talks about energy security as an issue which governments and defence organisations will increasingly have to be engaged in if the states are to maintain their standards of living and to ensure adequate supplies of natural resources at reasonable prices. There will be price spikes, bigger and greater than the one we saw a couple of years ago, and they'll be more frequent, and they will have an increased impact on our business. There will be supply problems that will be exacerbated by underinvestment, instability, and deliberate actions of states who are seeking wider political objectives. And specifically, resource competition, carbon pricing, increased energy demands, limitations imposed by climate change are likely to increase the cost of fossil fuels, which will stimulate the development of cleaner, renewable energies and the likes of nuclear. So you can see there is a remarkable synergy in the perspective of how we see the future on these 2 issues between the 2 countries. With that in mind, and recognising we haven't done that defence review yet, what next? Well, I think we have to seek the answers to a number of questions. Do we have sufficient understanding? If not, how are we going to get it? Where are we going to go to get that understanding that we need in order that we can treat climate change just like any other threat that we face? Factor it into our mainstream business, have indicators and warnings, and be able to conduct our business. Increasingly, it's become apparent that we need to address this, in the UK certainly, as a cross-government issue. No one department can deal with this. Climate change doesn't recognise departmental boundaries, the same way it doesn't recognise international boundaries. And we're going to have to bring in people we haven't talked to before, not just academics, but others who have sources of information that we will need to understand things. Because we need to establish a baseline of where we are. We need to understand the periodicity at which we need to review that baseline, and where our priorities should be, and where we have the ability to take risk, and what sort of risk we can afford to take. Because when we've done that, I think we can address 3 areas. What does it mean for our missions and tasks? Where, how frequently, and with who or whom? My own view is it will not change our force structures. We have the ability to fight across the spectrum of conflict. We can do humanitarian assistance. We can do war fighting. We can do conflict prevention. It's the priorities we put on those activities and the frequency in which we find ourselves doing them that may well change. And as I said earlier, we may well find ourselves working with actors we haven't worked with before. Now, why should we, in our respective countries, who are relatively immune to the changes that will come with increased temperature, worry about this? Well, if you look at where those stresses are, resource shortages, whether it be water, food, demographic challenges, health challenges, poor governance, and where climate change will have its greatest effect. That's where we've already seen conflicts in the last few years. We've seen the hotspots. But it's also where the world's trade routes run. And that's a bit that we need to recognise, because I have yet to come across a country that doesn't import anything. And just to make it clear, particularly in the energy context, it's not the Straits of Hormuz that necessarily worries me. It's the Straits of Bab el-Mandab. Because if you're a pirate in Bab el-Mandab, you don't need an outboard for your boat. You can row out to where these ships are going, because every ship goes through Yemeni territorial waters. So if we have to look at abilities of capacity building, maybe it's the Yemeni Coast Guard, all sorts of things like that. And I just use that as just one example. We need to be able to adapt to make sure we can do our business. And fundamental to that is ability to move. We in the UK, like everybody else, or in the military, or most of the military, are heavily dependent on fossil fuels. We spend about £1 billion a year of our defence budget, about 2.5%, two-thirds on operational fuel, a third on non-operational. But when you bring in the fully burdened cost of energy, it's nearer 15% of our defence budget that is involved in fuel and energy. We also need to be able to recognise, and certainly in the United Kingdom, where we have a Climate Change Act and targets, we need to mitigate and reduce the likelihood of further damage. But at the same time, we need to be able to deliver our departmental strategic objectives and do our business. We must also, while looking at that, continue to do the things we're doing already. In the case of adaptation, I've talked about this cross-government approach. In the UK, all government departments have been required to produce departmental adaptation plans. And to do that, they've had to talk to other departments. This is actually one of the big pluses of climate change, is we found ourselves talking to other departments rather than just working in our stovepipes. We've done a risk excuse me. We've done a risk analysis of our defence estate, or progressing it anyway, to look at those areas where there's a risk of flooding or other issues, and what we need to do. A lot of work on energy efficiency. Some of you may have heard me talk in the past about my aircraft carrier that did 12 inches to the gallon and burnt 20 tonnes of fuel. Well, it does 13 inches to the gallon now because we've painted the hull with a different paint. But it's more energy efficient. That 8% difference makes quite a difference in the number of times you need to replenish. Our meteorological office has done a lot of work on the impact of climate change on energy supplies. We need to understand, if we're going to have a broad portfolio of energy types, where we're going to get them from, where's the least risk. And we've both seen in both our countries that if you're more energy efficient, you can reduce the vulnerability of your forces. And Afghanistan is a good example. Half the convoys containing fuel, reduce the periodicity of those convoys, less risk to life and limb, and you can redeploy your soldiers. The third publication, which was probably missed when the other two came out at the beginning of February, was one on defence strategy for acquisition reform. We need to introduce sustainable acquisition procedures. Because if we're going to meet some of those targets, and our Climate Change Act talks about 80% reduction by 2050, a carbon budget, 12.5% reduction every 5 years or so, we need to be much more sustainable in that process in 4 areas. We need to think about sustainability when we're looking for what we're trying to achieve in the effect or the outcome. We need to consider it when we're looking at the possible options. It's got to be factored into the manufacturing, and most importantly, bearing in mind a lot of kit is around for many years, it needs to be factored into the through-life support. There are many challenges, but I think I've highlighted there are also opportunities. It isn't something that's going to go away. We've got to address it. But the aim must be to allow us to get on and continue to meet our objectives, whether it be current operations, or to prepare for future operations, or try and prevent future conflict. And I would suggest those are areas, as you saw in Amanda's slides, where there's real scope for collaboration. Collaboration not just internationally, but also between the private sector and the public sector. A lot of the work we've done with the Carbon Disclosure Programme with our suppliers is an example of that, but also, as we look at this sustainable acquisition area, again, working with the defence industry. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Admiral. Commander McClure.
see if I can do as well driving the PowerPoint. Touchpad. As Esther Dory and the Admiral have mentioned, this is a multifaceted problem. So when we put together the analytic plan, we wanted to integrate both the energy and climate from beginning to end. We started with a literature review, and our bibliography is about 8 pages now. As we went back and saw who had studied what and what they had said on this topic going back a decade or so. And then many of you were part of our outreach and the consultation we did to find out who else was currently thinking about it and what their thoughts were. And I'm going to spend most of my time talking about the questions we asked and the insights we gained on the energy piece. And then Paul is going to talk about what we gained on the climate side. I was fortunate enough to, in my Navy hat, be able to get energy risk played in the Global 09 War Game, the Title 10 event for the year, where for the first time they had a robust red threat detail and allowed that to influence the outcome of the game, and both outcomes were the same, and it turned into the dominating effect in the campaign was our effort to protect the energy sources. Air Force found something very similar in their game, and the ground forces are finding this out as they work in Afghanistan and Iraq. So we were able to fold that into our insights in the QDR. We partnered with Lawrence Livermore to do a energy footprint assessment for the department. This was the first time that that had been done. We tried to integrate the operational piece of it and the facilities piece of it, and found out that the way in which those two communities of use, if you will, define energy, how they account for energy, how they track the flows of energy, were so different. We're unable to even pictographically represent it in one of the Lawrence Livermore flow diagrams. So we ended up with 2 energy footprints, one for the facilities infrastructure, and I want to thank the folks at I&E who helped us with that, and particularly Andy Krigler and Brian Lally. And then DLA and DESI helped us out with the operational piece. Then we looked at the infrastructure vulnerability assessment. We provided the services with a list of questions and definitions, and we said go forth and assess your facilities and infrastructure that you think is important. What was very interesting for us was, with that minimal guidance they were given, that was, number one, the breadth and depth of the assessment they did. There were some 2,000 National Guard installations that were assessed, 19 for the Marine Corps, over 100 for the Navy and Air Force. But it was the similarity that the different services independently reported. Everybody in the Tidewater area recognizes their vulnerability to sea level rise. Numerous installations out west reported their concerns about increasing wildfire and drought. There were also some interesting gaps in that assessment. We would have expected more people to talk about the impact of increased temperatures on training ranges and training days, the number of black flag days you have. So we think there's some work still to be done here going forward in the future, as Esther Dory alluded to. We also did an adaptation activity assessment, and this was part of or linked in with work that the GAO had done. We wanted to know what the department is currently doing to adapt to climate change and who is thinking about it, how they're thinking about it, how it's being resourced. So that was a series of interesting engagements across both the services who have responsibility for the management of the infrastructure, and then OSD, who has an oversight and reporting responsibility. And our results were folded into the GAO study, which is available online if you're curious about the details of that. We also were able to participate in a tri-agency or interagency Secure Grid 09, and this was very valuable to us because this time we got to hear from the private sector. All of the utility companies, the regulatory functions. It was a very eye-opening experience about the true complexities of what you mean when you say grid security, and all of the thousands of actors who have regulatory and statutory functions that are involved in this. And this also highlighted some of our interests and concerns as we see an increasing nexus between IT and energy, as you talk about energy data management and who owns it and how you move it and who you know and how they know it. We worked with Oak Ridge National Labs on doing a climate change assessment. As DASD Dory has alluded to, we were very grateful to the good work of the U.S. Global Change Research Program Office in doing a U.S. assessment. But for us in DoD, we have a worldwide portfolio, and we're very interested in what's going on out in the various regions that the geographic combatant commanders are responsible for. So Oak Ridge provided that assessment for us, and that's available online to anybody who is interested. And then we ended up in sort of an analytic branch plan for you operational planners, branches and sequels. We ended up going to the Arctic in a branch plan, if you will, and looking at capability and capacity requirements for that area, which is experiencing extraordinarily rapid climate change that is having current impacts on, most significantly on the Coast Guard, but also impacts on the services as well. These are the energy outreach questions. And my highlight here would be these are open-ended questions intended to provoke engagement. There are not easy answers. We provided the same questions to all of the groups that we engaged with and asked them to answer based on their interest and expertise. And we found it very interesting where we had clusters of things people wanted to talk about and where we had relative paucity of inputs. We asked people to talk not only about the problems, but also about the solutions. So on the second page, the things I'm keying in here is we were interested in what this community thought that DoD's role in research and development might be. A lot of people referred to the DARPA model and then looked at the ARPA-E model and looked at what we could do as far as being either a test bed for products or an early adopter for products, particularly those that call or speak to the operational energy issue. And we looked at what acquisition or business process reforms might help us in our energy posture. It's clear that DoD must reduce the vulnerability of its operating forces both at home and overseas to interruptions in energy supplies through a variety of means or actors. And leading this is going to be one of the key tasks of the incoming Director of Operational Energy Plans and Programs when confirmed. Another one of our strategic themes that we found as we started binning all of the various inputs that we had received was the importance of maintaining security in the global commons because of how much of the energy that's required for transportation, this is the oil, the fossil fuels, moves by sea, and the nexus between the critical choke points that we have in sea lines of communication. The linkage between energy security and economic security that DASD Dory referred to was brought home and kind of in real time for us by the price spikes and the gas price run-up in 2008. Less obvious, but perhaps of more long-term concern is that smart grid initiatives where we're seeing variable renewable energy resources integrated into a brittle grid at the same time as we see people moving towards variable demand. And as a former chief engineer, I tell you that equation doesn't work out real well for very long. And there's also the issue, as I mentioned, with the smart grid, who's collecting the data and where is it going and what are the security standards for that. So we see an intersection between energy security and cyber security in the future that we found interesting. And as DASD Dory highlighted, DoD can play an important role working with both the private sector and with other agencies in helping transition new technologies from the labs to the field. This last slide that I'm going to speak to really gets to where DoD lives. The first slide on the right is a fuel convoy going into Afghanistan, and I've got to say, as an operator, that looks like a sweet stationary target. Second one is underway replenishment or operational forces refueling at sea. So both the land services and the sea services share this vulnerability. Now, as we look at what we can do about it, we think that acquisition reform that places a new priority on understanding the energy performance, or if you will, the energy productivity of new systems is important. It's not just miles per gallon. It's what that system brings to the battle space, how efficiently and effectively it does that. So as we look at some of the new platforms, and down there at the bottom of the slide, you see the Joint Strike Fighter, the Littoral Combat Ship, and the JLTV, Joint light tactical vehicle that's under development. How are these programs, all of them at critical points in their acquisition pathway, going to look at energy? Are they just going to look at it as part of the traditional operation and sustainment cost? Are they going to look at how energy plays not only when you're deployed, but also when you're in garrison or where you're used in training? How are we going to account for that total operating cost from the energy perspective? And as DASD Dory mentioned, making this logistics tail visible and letting threats to logistics affect the outcome of our wargaming campaign analysis, we think is one of the critical first steps to illustrating this vulnerability that for far too long has been unseen and unattended to. Pending your questions, that concludes my brief.
Last but not least,
Marines bat and clean up.
And while I'm getting the slide up, I just want to take this opportunity to, on behalf of Esther and myself, thank all of you that we did talk to during this outreach process. As a former infantry officer turned lawyer turned prosecutor turned environmental attorney turned strategist, I'm not the expert on this stuff. It's you all in the room that were patient and kind enough to take the time to discuss this. So thank you. I'd also like to thank on behalf of Esther and myself, you, DASD Dory, just because it's not all that often that you get a boss in the Pentagon who says, "Hey, go out and talk to people about a fascinating issue." And oh yeah, you do get to get outside of the Pentagon and escape the puzzle palace too. So that was a fabulous opportunity. Thank you for that, ma'am. Since I'm the last person between what we hope is going to be a very robust question and answer period, I'm gonna give some of this somewhat short shrift. However, I did want to touch on the outreach questions that we talked about with most of you in this room. And if we did not get a chance to come and talk to you, it wasn't because we excluded you. It was just because we simply ran out of time. If in a perfect world where if you could write the DoD with unlimited time, write the QDR with unlimited time resources, I think we would still be going out and talking to people about these issues. So, if we didn't get a chance to actually come out and talk to you, it wasn't because we snubbed you. It was just we didn't get a chance. And I'll have our contact information at the end of the brief. We're happy to engage always on these issues. On the climate change outreach portion, we had 16 questions that we drafted on climate change to prompt discussion. I'm not going to read all of them, but I did want to highlight just a few of them that actually seemed to generate the most debate within our outreach process. And the first one, probably I shouldn't have highlighted this as much as highlighted the actual title of the slide, because there was quite a bit of discussion about should we be talking about climate change or should we be talking about environmental security as a whole. A lot of experts told us, well, we think that by focusing on climate change, you run the risk of excluding other important environmental issues. Climate change, if it's going to be effectively addressed, you have to understand the relationship between climate change and the other environmental issues. For too long, we've had stovepipes where one person thinks about water issues, one person thinks about forestry issues, one person thinks about economic issues, one person thinks about population growth issues. And in this case, all these issues are intertwined. So that was a comment that we received with a lot of frequency. The next group of the outreach questions, I've highlighted what, if anything, can the DoD do to assist in adaptation to climate change? And this triggered a lot of discussion about what DoD's role should be. I think it's fairly easy to say that DoD can assist with adaptation, but the question a lot of people asked was, should DoD be doing this? A lot of people would start the conversation with, the DoD's role is to win wars and fight battles. adaptation efforts are not either of those two things. Now, the flip side response to that is, well, maybe the DoD's mission is to obey the lawful orders of the Commander-in-Chief. And if the Commander-in-Chief decides that the DoD has something to add on this topic, then maybe it's worthwhile for the DoD to engage. And the last group of questions you'll see highlighted at the bottom was probably our most popular one. To make a bad pun, it was a icebreaker of sorts for most of our discussions. Everybody, regardless of where you fell across the political spectrum, almost everybody wanted to talk about geoengineering. And interestingly enough, the responses were completely all over the place. The responses ranged from people who said, if you start talking about geoengineering, people are going to think about, oh, the military is starting to weaponize climate change. You shouldn't even be asking us these questions. It's such a bad idea. And then on the other end of the scale, some people were saying, well, we're never going to be able to address the emissions problem enough to do anything about climate change. Because of that, the only solution is geoengineering. And DoD, you're the only institution that is capable of affecting a worldwide geoengineering solution. So it really was a very diverse range of responses. And I'm going to go through our synthesis fairly quickly because it is all in the QDR. There's no surprises at this point. Esther Dory already talked about the link between energy and climate change, and the link between climate change and national security is addressed in the QDR. On the policy considerations, the DoD Organization for Climate Change, we found as we started this process that there are a huge amount of practitioners within the DoD who are working on climate change issues. However, it seems that everybody is in their own little foxhole, so to speak. There's not a lot of coordination. That coordination is improving thanks to what we've done in the QDR, but an ongoing question that's open for debate is how should the DoD organize for climate change, if at all? Do we need to change our organization, or are we fine with how things currently exist? Esther Dory already touched on the opportunities for leadership. We've also talked about the expansion of humanitarian assistance and disaster relief and the new operating theater in the Arctic. And lastly, for potential initiatives, the DoD has the opportunity to be a leader on mitigation. Even though if the DoD ceased to exist, that wouldn't solve the world's emissions problems. But you all know we are the largest energy consumer in the federal government. The DoD also may be able to assist with the necessary intel and information gathering that's going to be required if we are going to, in fact, successfully monitor an international regime on emissions. And lastly, the adaptation, and this is something that the picture refers to, and I had to take a gratuitous shot at the Navy. I wanted to show off those new Navy digital camis, but adaptation through mill-to-mill engagements is a tremendous opportunity for the military. Not only because in a lot of the developing countries that are going to be hit by climate change, their militaries are the only organizations that have the infrastructure to do the necessary disaster planning and response, but also because the DoD, as a property owner, is going to deal with the impacts of climate change on our installations, and almost all of those lessons that we learn are going to be transferable to the civilian sector. So anyway, that concludes my brief. We are going to roll into the question section. You have a copy of the QDR, just the energy and environment section. If you want the whole thing, the website is up there, and Esther and my email addresses are up there as well. Thank you.
Terrific. Well, thank you all so very much. It's It's obviously a really big topic and a challenge to wrap one's arms around, but as we suggested from the outset, our objective here is to communicate some of the process and some of the thinking and how folks in both national contexts kind of got to where we are, and with some really important analysis and a couple very important documents, and then engage with this really expert crowd on ways forward and getting feedback, getting an exchange going that, as the emails there and other contexts suggest, want to be an ongoing dialogue, and that this is part of it. So I'm going to open the floor up. If I have colleagues with microphones, if you would use those and state your name and where you're coming from, that would be terrific. I think we'll collect a couple and do 3 or 4 questions and then give you guys a chance to divide and conquer in responding to that. I know there will be a lot of questions. We want to give everyone an opportunity, and also in part because of the need to jump on an airplane, Dastey Dory is going to leave us a few minutes early, so we want to particularly start with ones that address her presentation as well. So who would like to kick us off? Kayla, if we can go down here, and then gentleman over here.
Hi, Marisa Lino. I work for Northrop Grumman. I would like to ask a very simple question. Aside from the whatever impact Vice President Gore's film had and the community that focuses on climate change, how important do you feel it is that the Defense Department has addressed this issue and has included it in the QDR, the CNA report and other things, to bringing it to the fore?
Okay, that's one. Sean, if we could go right there, and then we'll go right back up over there.
Hi, my name is Kate Brandt, and I'm a Special Assistant to the Secretary of the Navy. Commander McClure and Dastey Dory, you both mentioned this idea of using our installations and our tactical uses as a test bed for innovative technologies, and also using DoD to transition technologies from the lab to the field. And I know in the QDR you talk about a couple different mechanisms that are in place for looking at doing that. So I was just interested in hearing a little bit more about that and what plans you have going forward in that arena.
Okay, thank you very much. The gentleman right there.
Good afternoon. I'm Oliver Fritz from the U.S. Air Force. First of all, thank you very much for coming. I was really excited to see this part of the QDR be in the QDR. I think it's a big step forward. My question relates to the notion of, you've got the energy and climate change section that talks about changing the way we use energy, energy as a force multiplier, and then totally separate from the climate change section was, being the Air Force, I look closely at the guidance to Air Forces, and it said to increase our average range of our Air Forces. And I'm just curious as to your thinking on whether those were linked, if they were linked, if not, maybe what the future looks like for that. Thank you.
Okay. We take one more there, right, Sean? Before we give our panelists a chance to respond.
Hi, I'm Matthew Marigi with Air Force International Affairs. I just wanted to ask a quick question that was more or less addressed by all of you in some capacity, and that's the future of using DoD's military-to-military relationships and security assistance arms towards combating climate change and finding out ways to become more energy efficient. I guess mainly interested most of all in what kind of collaborative efforts have already been put in place by DoD, and which ones through all the different services that will be pushed forward down the road. Everything from building military capacity, as Lieutenant Colonel Schimpf mentioned, for environmental, combating environmental cataclysms, but also what future policies could be done, collaboration with jet fuels, biofuels, and whatnot. So basically specific policies and specific ways forward.
Perfect, yeah. That mill-to-mill one, as many of you who've been at this for a while know, is fortunately the U.S. military and the U.K. In collaboration and in bilateral relationships have a long history of that. And so mercifully we're not building on a blank slate. Who would like to jump off? Amanda, would you like to?
I'll take a whack at a few of those. Starting with your question about DoD's attention to this issue set now, and the linkage to national security and what that means. Maybe by telling a little bit of a story, and this maybe demonstrates a certain sense of naivete on the work that we were doing and its relevance. About 10 years ago, working in the strategy office as an action officer at the time, I had the opportunity to work on a national security strategy in the Clinton administration. And at the time, there were already those who foresaw climate change and energy as issues that impact on national security. But at the time, I think the general understanding wasn't sufficient writ large, and within the national security community, the kind of core parts of the national security community, if you think about Department of Defense and State Department and the intelligence community, to kind of let new issues into the classic security agenda. And so within the national security strategy, there was treatment of those issues, but not necessarily as priority issues or fundamental issues. And I think you can really see a significant change, over a decade to where we are now, and their treatment within documents like the forthcoming national security strategy, and then within the department for the QDR. So there's been that gradual evolution in the community that I think is very, very important, as you're alluding to. I think the work that we were doing within the QDR, the strategy office had been doing work on climate and energy related trends as part of our horizon scanning work that we do, or our futures work, for several years, but it hadn't emerged in any kind of significant way in these strategy and guidance documents. Thanks to the QDR legislation, we were doing it by design and in a more significant way. In the course of the summer, in the August timeframe, we were taking lots of press queries about different aspects of the QDR. And the New York Times wanted to do an interview talking about the climate change work that we were doing. And that interview on a slow news day on a weekend ended up being incorporated into an article that was on the front page of the New York Times, that I think caught us all by surprise, that was perceived as so significant that the Department of Defense was now looking at these issues. And that's created its own kind of strategic communications dynamic going forward that many in this room are familiar with. But I think the idea that military organizations are now directly treating these issues in a way that they didn't before is quite significant, especially to the kind of the early buyers, so to speak, and those who recognized clearly quite some time ago that these were issues that needed to be dealt with. So in response to that, and I will also take on the Air Force question about the Air Force guidance and increasing average ranges. There is not a deliberate direct connection between those two sections, but certainly you can see where there is actually there wasn't a intended linkage between the two, but it actually exists. So I think that answers your question there. And then the question about the military to military engagement. The report itself refers to a couple of existing programs, and the defense, the DIAC program is an existing one within acquisition technology and logistics that's quite small scale for the department. It's under $2 million a year, so that's in the overall scale of things quite limited, but that's one that we see the need to ramp up funding in a significant way over time. And you see some other programs that exist that we're talking about increasing. So that's kind of the first low-hanging fruit where we can ramp up some resources. The second is to look at what doesn't exist yet that should, and that will be part of our work going ahead. We have ideas there about creating an innovation fund that the services will be able to compete to get these extra resources to help in driving innovation within the department. The other area where we're looking, I referenced briefly the discussions we've had with AID, for example, and their new dedicated climate change funding, where we think there are good opportunities there to be working with them on how those resources are used, and to the extent that they begin to look at military institutions in other countries as targets of opportunity for this type of work, and the resources that we can bring to bear alongside them.
Others?
Obviously, I can't talk for the QDR, but if I can offer a couple of perspectives on this issue of the military becoming engaged in climate security. Is this a militarization of an issue, or is there a reason for it? I think in the UK, the UN Security Council debate in 2007, which our Foreign Secretary led, didn't get much traction. People weren't paying much attention, except in the context of the government departments. And it was the introduction of our first national security strategy in 2008, where we talked about climate change as potentially the greatest threat to global stability and security that we faced in the future, that people started to become interested, and they were starting to be interested. I think the thing that came as the biggest shock was the fact that the Ministry of Defence, the Foreign Office, and the Department for International Development were all three of them talking about it, and talking about it as a security issue, and that made people start to think, well, actually, maybe there's something in that. And my appointment fell out of that part to have an active duty officer doing this. But I think that in the UK, there is still some way to go to complete that transition to everybody seeing, in the public, seeing it as a security issue. And I think that will come with our defence review. Because if you look in the Green Paper, there's a very limited reference to climate security and climate change. The bulk is in this Defence Concepts and Doctrine Centre document, and not everybody knows you have to read the two in conjunction altogether. So there's that side of things. On the military-to-military relationship, yes, undoubtedly, and through existing allies, as you talked about, Jeff. Also in our Green Paper, we talk about partnerships, new partnerships with people, and we'll find ourselves. I think there is a potential wariness in the conflict prevention piece amongst some of the military, that we don't want to get dragged into this. The reality is, I think we will be involved, but we'll be involved in a very discreet fashion, in the sense small packages of activity, along with many other actors, some of whom are government actors, some of whom are international organisations, and some of whom are non-government organisations. And the challenge will be to bring that all together in a coherent manner to deliver what we're trying to look for. In the interim, as far as for example, between the four services here in the UK in military-to-military relationships, in developing our understanding, that is very much something that's going on. Easier for us in the sense because we are smaller armed forces and we tend to do much more on a joint basis. So we have one defence fields group. They talk to the United States Army, United States Air Force, United States Navy and the Marine Corps. But they also talk to Richard Branson and the commercial world to see what they're doing. Because if he's willing to fly me around in an aircraft that's got some mixture of fuel, then probably we ought to be taking some of that risk as well as some of our military aircraft.
Terrific. Can I just follow up, Admiral, to ask you, you referred to the fact that DFID, FCO, and MOD were coming to the issue with similar frames. Do you have any lessons learned from that ongoing process that you would suggest, as in this country we are talking a lot about the 3Ds of defense diplomacy and development, and looking perhaps for all sorts of insights on joined-up government, as you call it, for going forward, because as many people have alluded to here in the panel, and certainly in the larger discussion of this, it's the what role and how do we collaborate and both stay in our lanes, but understand that we have to collaborate in different ways with different impacts and such.
I think we learned a lesson in the military when we set up our post-conflict resolution unit, which was the same three departments. And our approach was, look, we've got the answer, just do it our way and it'll be very easy. A funny old thing, the other departments took a certain degree of umbrage to this. And I think we've learned from that. Mm-hmm. You've got to take the best of all to offer. One of the areas that you need to address early on is the education piece amongst those who are going to work together. It's no good waiting until you're doing operations. And in my last job as Commandant of our Joint Services Command and Staff College, I was absolutely adamant that we had to have Foreign Office students and we had to have DFID students amongst others. And if it meant I had to modulise the course for non-military students and they'd only turn up for certain packages, that was fine. because we had to understand each other, understand our language. They had to recognize we only had 2 heads and 4 feet and this sort of thing. And we could work together then, and it becomes so much easier when you're on operations. So there's a lot of investment, a lot of patience. But something like this, which just spreads across the departments, it is easier.
Okay, terrific. Esther, Paul, do you have quick interventions? Yeah?
I'll give you a couple of thought groups here, again, drawing on engineering background. The question about testbed for innovation and how to transition from lab to field. I think the Marine Corps is doing a very interesting thing with their XFOB. Bring us the best you've got from your off-the-shelf, and we'll test it in a field environment, and if it works, we'll deploy it. So that's a new take on rapid equipping that moves out of the 5 to 20-year typical defense acquisition cycle. So I think that's one way in which the department can help by changing and reforming our acquisition processes. And another way is by sending that demand signal so that the people who are trying to develop these new technologies have a pull. They're not just pushing it out into a vacuum, and that's where we see some real opportunity to partner with DOE, who has 18 labs, but they're relatively stovepiped and have a very hard time finding a market. Whereas we have a ready-made market, thousands, tens of thousands of facilities in different environments where we can deploy these technologies and see how they work. Do they work in the Southwest? Do they work in the Northeast? We can provide that sort of a customer base for them. And on the planning piece, if we talk about sustainability and exercise planning, that in itself is a powerful learning tool for the militaries we work with. Being in the Navy, when we started talking about picking up the plastic bottles, that was kind of eye-opening to some of our partners we were working with. So if we extend that to talking about water management and energy management as how we set up and plan and how we operate, I think there's an opportunity to, as Dasdi Dory said, show leadership in the way that we have incorporated these concerns into our culture, which if you look at it from a long-term perspective just makes sense.
Just very, very briefly, on the integration of the QDR's energy and climate findings to the services, just we need to all understand that unfortunately changing the DoD is somewhat like trying to steer the Titanic. Change doesn't happen very quickly, and I think we will eventually get there. And back to the first question on why this is important. I think it is very important because, like it or not, we need to recognize that the DoD is one of the most credible institutions in our society. We're, in fact, probably viewed by a lot of people as one of the last honest brokers. So I think it is very significant. However, on the flip side of that, we need to be careful that we don't over-exaggerate stuff, because that would destroy the DoD's credibility, and I won't talk any more about that because others have written much more eloquently than what I could say.
Thank you, Paul. So I don't have another round of questions. Yes, sir. Back. Get a couple in the back.
Hi, and thank you for being here. I'm Pat Williams from the Air Force, obviously. My question is, how widespread is the understanding of this issue internationally, and how will that compel other nations to seek nuclear energy? But more importantly, how do you anticipate the impact on our nuclear deterrence efforts?
Okay, and then Kaylee just behind him. Yeah.
Marlo Lewis with the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and this goes to Mr. Schimpf's comment about not exaggerating in order to maintain DoD's credibility. And I would expand that to say that your assessment of climate change as a security risk or as a factor in U.S. national security should look at both sides of the ledger, not just the risks that are associated with climate change, but also with climate change policies. It's typical of people in Congress, for example, to only talk about the threat that they are going to save us from. But you folks have to be the ones to exercise some adult supervision, and that means that you've got to point out that sometimes even the best medications can have lethal side effects. And just to give a simple example of what I mean, there are many studies out there, of course this is all very controversial, that say that The climate bills that are being debated now in Congress will have very severe effects on the U.S. economy. And you can't really have a first-rate military power based on a second-rate economy. And money, in other words, is the sinew of war. So if it's true that climate change policies have the risk, the potential of severe effects on the economy, it could also be very detrimental to U.S. national security. And there are a whole bunch of other ways in which we could have security risks arising from these purported solutions. But I just encourage you to address that. I didn't see any discussion of that in the QDR. And so my question is, I guess, will you be addressing that in the future? I hope you do for the sake of your own credibility.
Sean, down here in the front, Tom Spencer and Catherine Silverth.
Thank you, Jeff. Tom Spencer, Institute for Environmental Security. I want to compliment the panel on the presentation and the thoroughness of it. 11 years ago, I held a hearing in the Foreign Affairs Committee of the European Parliament and asked a similar set of questions. They were the same questions, and we didn't have answers at that stage. However, I then want, especially in the light of the last question, to suggest a thought experiment not for public consumption, but things you might think about at night. If you look at these issues in the domestic U.S. mainland context, the Coast Guard, etc., you get one set of responses. If you look at them in that kind of comfortable second area, which is the Arctic, again, somehow we feel we can deal with the Arctic. If you really want to test whether the arguments are real, test it on the Himalayas and the Tibetan Plateau, because that takes you into all the difficult issues. The relationship with China, the relationship between China and India, the stability of Pakistan, the impact on development policy. We don't need to get into when glaciers melt. That's not the problem. It's when the river flow starts to fall. So it's those set of arguments that need to be addressed privately as to test the validity of what have become often standard assertions. And I wish you luck and many good nights of sleep.
Okay. Tom, if you could keep that with Catherine, although because of time, I'm going to give Amanda a chance to respond to any of these, and then we'll go straight to Catherine because of her imminent departure.
Good. Well, that was a foreshadowing, I guess. On the issue, excuse me, the issue about different national solutions to the challenges of energy security, and to what extent will nuclear power become more prominent in national decisions, and to what extent does that pose challenges for nuclear, you said deterrence, but I think nuclear proliferation in the first instance, but deterrence is an associated issue as well. In our QDR work, we didn't project forward potential trends based on those national choices to try to forecast what we think the combination or composition of energy sources will be in the future. We've certainly seen a lot of the work that's been done to do that, but would agree with the assertion that to the extent that nuclear power consumption grows over time based on those national choices, it certainly does have downstream impacts as far as proliferation concerns and challenges to deterrence if proliferation concerns unfold. So I think it's on our radar screen. It's not in the report per se, but certainly that is an effect that we could foresee. On the issue of climate risks and climate policies per se, you would not see in the QDR, nor would you expect to see the department commenting on pending legislation. That's not the role of what this type of review would do. Certainly we're following the debate on the Hill closely, but what the review does is lay out what our defense strategy is in the future, what capabilities and capacities are required. I think it's very important for the department, kind of given the polarized atmosphere on this subject, is to continue to walk the line that's entirely appropriate for the department, which is to recognize climate change, to recognize the uncertainties surrounding climate change and acknowledge those. And we have uncertainties in many different areas where we're doing force planning, and that's part of the world that force planning takes place in. So we do not comment within the review or elsewhere on whether, what is causing climate change, what the national solution should be. That's being handled outside of the department. What we're taking is we have an environment in which we'll have to operate. There's uncertainty associated with it, but the prudent planning would require us to take certain steps now and to continue to monitor and assess in the future. And then the thought experiment, we will certainly take advantage of that thought experiment. The two particular issues that you raised, the Arctic. There's a fair amount of activity right now trying to understand. The projections are very uncertain in the Arctic, and the difference between the portrayal of the Arctic as a Wild West resource grab environment that you see in the press, and then the reality of the scientific projections and what we know, it could not be farther apart. And that again falls into this prudent planning range where you can certainly see there are investments that need to be made now. There are activities that may not unfold for decades hence, but this is something where our domain awareness, we certainly need to make investments as a U.S. government now, to include Department of Defense and others. The Coast Guard's ice-breaking capacity is certainly under-resourced relative to today's needs as well as future needs, so that's absolutely on the table, and will keep us awake at night.
Okay. Would anyone else, Amanda, we'll say thank you to you, because
yes,
if you don't leave, you will miss that plane.
Yes.
So
thank you very much, and I apologize for leaving early.
Catherine, why don't we grab another question for you, and then give our panelists an opportunity to respond as well, but wanted to get yours in the mix.
Great. Catherine Silverthorne, E3G. My question actually goes to the next steps element of this. I'm curious, when you're looking at assessing the impacts on installations, you've asked for an assessment of impacts on installations, or looking at what the impacts might be on fragile states, you sort of need to have an idea of what amount of warming you're assessing or planning to. Are you looking at 2 degrees? Are you looking at 4 degrees? Are you looking at 6 degrees? And I think if you look at the policy conversations domestically and internationally, all of those potential futures are on the table. So is there going to be some guidance in terms of how these assessments are done? Are you going to be looking at various alternatives and keeping those all on the table and comparing them? Or is there a temperature future that you think is most likely that you're going to recommend?
Admiral, could we start with you on that one, given that the Hadley Center has one of the most interesting maps I've seen in a long time with a 4-degree future?
Yeah, I mean, the world, as one of the key things that came out of the Copenhagen Accord, is striving to keep temperatures at no more than 2 degrees above pre-industrial. That's a hell of a challenge. And I think you've got to be realistic. I think you've got to look at a 2, you've got to look at a 4. That will expose that today we don't understand the difference that happens in that gap. And we need to do more research, because we don't know if there are going to be abrupt changes or it's linear or whatever. I would caution against the 6-degree version. There is a temptation with climate change, depending, you get extremes of perspective. Even in a country like UK, where there's broadly a bipartisan view that climate change is happening and that humans have contributed to it. We either are all doomed, or someone else will say, no, this is the second coming of Y2K. It's not an issue. Don't worry about it. And what we've actually got to do is fill in the gaps in our knowledge. Because I don't think you can address these things until you have a reasonable understanding. You're never going to get 100% answers. And we never do in any of the threats we trace. 80% is perfectly acceptable, or even 60% on occasions. But at the moment, there are gaps which we need to fill. And to me, that is a classic example. There is no point in the Hadley Center doing some stuff, Tyndale Center doing some stuff in the United Kingdom, centers in America doing stuff, centers in Europe doing stuff. Yes, we need to look across the spectrum, and we don't want to get ourselves sucked down to just one route and one answer. We need to look at a portfolio of answers, but we ought to do that in a coordinated fashion. and we need to have conviction. Now, that is not a Department of Defense business. That is government's business, international business, for which we can contribute to. For example, the Met Office is part of the UK Department of Defence, Ministry of Defence, and we can benefit from. But we need to do that work and fill in those gaps to a certain degree of confidence before we start making some of these decisions. And I think in that sense it answers some of the questions or some of the points about the climate change policies as much as the issues on the actual climate change itself.
Esther, Paul, would you?
Yeah. In the strategy office, our role is to do this horizon scanning and then use the results of that analysis to influence the strategic guidance documents, which then move out into AT&L in the Office of Undersecretary of Defense for Installation and Environment to provide guidance to the services who actually own these installations as to how to do this assessment. So there's a process handoff, if you will, that will occur. It's fairly clear from the science that the impacts over the next 20 to 30 years are locked in by the CO2 already in the atmosphere. And if you look at what the replacement cycle is for your infrastructure, you can say, well, we build a building and we expect it to last 50 years or 67 years. That gives you another planning horizon to work with. Another consideration they're going to have to look at is what's the portfolio management perspective, because if you're talking about bases in Tidewater, Virginia, or bases along the North Carolina coast, if one service were to say, well, our response is going to be build the levee that will take care of the 500-year flood, well, that makes the next base down the coast the sacrificial anode, if you will, for that floodwater. Then you expand that thought process a little bit and say, well, if the town decides that they're going to build the levee, maybe then the federal lands becomes the extended wetland for the floodplain, and then how does that impact on our usage of the land? So it rapidly becomes a very complex issue, and I know that in the INE office they're beginning to think how to frame this analytic challenge. Another thing I'll say is, and I'm going to use an nautical term here, you start out from the dock, you say, I'm heading in this direction, but you get to change course over time. So as they get new studies and new analysis and new scientific findings, we'll be revisiting and make sure that we're heading in the right direction.
The only thing that I'd add on a lot of force coming out. The only thing that I'd add is just on the part about, is DOD exaggerating? I think it was put very well in CNA's groundbreaking study talking about how the DOD doesn't have the luxury of waiting for 100% certainty. And that really makes us turn out to be all glass half empty type of people. It's our business to be prudent and look at things not with the everything coming up roses scenario.
Okay, why don't we collect a few more questions? Okay. Over here.
Hi, Laura Hussey from Schweitzer Engineering Laboratories, and my question is really directed at EJ, and then I'd also be interested in the other panelists' thoughts on it, but particularly maybe the UK perspective on this. I want to go back to the electric power grid and your reference to the fact that we have three variables that we're layering on an aging infrastructure: variable generation, variable load, and cybersecurity concerns. And I see that in the context of the QDR and the climate change issue. The variable generation is an attempt, the renewable portfolio is an attempt to address reliance on fossil fuel and reduce our reliance on fossil fuel. The variable load component of smart grid infrastructure is an attempt to incorporate more efficiency into the use of the infrastructure and get consumers more involved in reducing the loads. And cybersecurity is cybersecurity. It's a reality in the world we live in. The solution to that, that variable generation, variable load, is to have the infrastructure be beefed up a little bit, have better automation to deal with variables at both ends. That part's kind of invisible. I think it is going on, but as part of smart grid deployment, but it's somewhat invisible. What do you see as DoD's role in ensuring that the infrastructure, in a privately owned grid, is getting beefed up to support the climate change variables at either end. And perhaps to add on to that, does UK have anything that we could learn from here?
Okay. Maybe if you could hand that microphone just to behind you. Had two in a row there. Go ahead, sir.
Okay. Paul Rogie from the Army. I'm going to pile on EJ a little bit. First, I'd like to thank you for pointing out the need to look at total cost of doing your business, getting home sooner, as opposed to the mantra that seems to be coming up that we need to look for this fully burdened cost of fuel, and that's my bottom line answer. Especially when we're looking at a growing spectrum of operations we need to accomplish. So the question that I have is, when you talk about this idea of having a military utility and looking for the energy effectiveness of your solutions, have you talked to anybody who have ideas about how to measure that when you're going into combat, stability operations, humanitarian assistance? How do you measure how effective this was and the contribution of energy to that?
Okay. Sir, did you have one as well?
Yeah. Adam Seal, Northrop Grumman Analysis Center. I wanted to take the thread and discussion in a different way. Basically, the U.S. QDR takes climate change just as a given, and it's a factor that contributes rather than perhaps questioning whether at the high range of threats it's such a threat to national security that the QDR may have had a role to call for national efforts to mitigate. And the choice not to do that is an interesting one, taking the reverse of if you take the spectrum of where the threats are, the choice not to discuss it in that way seems very interesting.
Okay, thank you. Gentleman over here.
Dr. Gamliel, Southern Command. My request is to the Admiral to tell us about his kingdom energy interest, climate change adaptation interest, and working together with the United States on those issues in South America.
Okay, regional. I think this is probably our final chance for questions before we give the panel last. I want to make sure everyone has a chance. Looking at some of these folks who've been laboring for decades on this, because I know you have lots to contribute. We'll follow up the conversation. Admiral, would you like to kick us off in a final set of comments?
I'm going to come back to the South American one because I have to say you've got me cold on that. Power grids. Well, one bit of advice is don't leave it as late as we have. We have an aging infrastructure in our power grids that we urgently need to address, and we are starting to address now. And some of that has been done by electricity companies, but we're actually forcing them to put money back into the system. Having been allowed to have price rises, it's now got to go back in to deliver that infrastructure. Much of that is not unique to defence, and our demands are no different from many other companies. In many areas, in fact, they're less. There are areas where we have specific and discrete demands, and there are those which we may well look to ourselves to provide that capability as well. So in a sense, we fall in with everybody else on that one. On the South American piece, if I understand correctly, your question is, what are we doing about supporting adaptation in South America? Well, I think you've got, as a Department of Ministry of Defence, we're not doing very much. But what we have been doing is we've been doing studies with CNA here in Washington and with RUSI into what the effects are. Our Foreign Office and our Department for International Aid and Development are also engaged in that process. And as you're aware, our Prime Minister is amongst others who's pledged that money needs to go into the system to do some of that adaptation. The challenge is to ensure that's done in a coherent fashion.
Commander McClure?
All right, I'll take the grid question first. I think resilience is a key, and diversity of supply is a key. And for the military, where we live is what are our task critical assets and missions. and effects that we feel from a grid blackout here in America because of our distributed net-centric operations could have very short-order impacts on people on the front line, depending on where the intelligence is being processed and where things are being controlled from. So it's our first step is to identify those areas and make sure that we have appropriately provided for the required self-sufficiency. And I think I'm going to harp back on something that Dazzy Dory said about an area to show leadership in. And by putting money into wargaming and by talking about the issue, I think we can support the Department of Energy, working with NIST and the other folks who are working on standards to move forward in this issue and keep it on the front table. And I'll tell you, when the Secretary of Defense talked to the Secretary of Energy, this was one of the issues they talked about. So I think it's a slow and steady race, and unfortunately, sometimes when you have a system this vast and complex and expensive, it takes crises sometimes to make step function changes. But until then, I think if we set the vector and continue to work this, there are initiatives ongoing within the department to address this. They're collaborative, they're cross communities, they're not stovepiped. So I think that's a good first step. Second thing, fully burdened cost of fuel. It's just a way to expose the externalities of cost when you look at how you get energy to combat forces. And it's very scenario dependent. So when you look at energy productivity, that's the term that I like to package this issue in. How much does it cost me and what does it get me? What's my return on that investment? That's also going to be very scenario dependent. Is your environment benign? How critical is the mission? What are you willing to pay to achieve that mission? So there's unfortunately not a clear and simple answer. I think that part of the innovation that we've talked about is not just in energy gadgets and technology. It's also in our analytic processes and tool sets to help us understand this. Because if we just say we want the ship and we want it to go 40 knots, and we haven't looked at the mission in the context, we're buying a huge bill that we're going to live with for the 35-year life of that class of ships. So I think it's important to us as stewards of the taxpayers' resources to develop the tools to better understand the consequences of the decision. And in the end of the day, it may be because this mission is so critical, that speed is a necessary function. If I've done my campaign analysis, that is what I need, then that is a cost we need to understand and accept. But I think we've accepted the cost without fully understanding it until 2008 when the price went up and other things had to fall out of the budget. And I'm going to let Paul talk about the science.
Thank you. In response to the question about why haven't we really talked about more of the catastrophic climate change impacts in the QDR, I think we need to consider 2 points. First, the QDR is kind of by nature a foundational document only. It sets the basis for where we're going to go in the future, but also maintain our flexibility to go in different directions. So I don't know that it would be appropriate to go into some of the different possible projections that are out there in the QDR. The second point is we received guidance in the legislation to use the mid-course projections from the IPC. That translated to us relying on the work of the Global Change Research Program. Dazzy Dory talked in her presentation about the fact that DoD we're not climate scientists. We don't want to go into that business. We're going to rely on the work of others. And right now the work that we're relying on doesn't have those projections in it. Quickly on South America. I'm not gonna put them on the spot and embarrass them, but U.S. Southern Command does have some representatives in the audience today. There are Southcom is probably one of the more forward-leaning commands as far as climate change and energy issues go. So it is being looked at. And just one final throwaway comment on the power grid and why we should care, why DoD should care about about civilian-owned assets. I don't think it's realistic to assume that the DoD could solve all of its grid problems by islanding islanding its bases. DoD is only as strong as our people, and if you have DoD installations islanded and up and running, but our people's houses in the surrounding communities don't have power, where is that going to get us? Our people are going to go and look after their families, so it has to be all completely linked.
Well, we've obviously had a very rich discussion that has gone from the 30,000-foot view down to some technical issues that the Admiral's admonition that we need to learn each other's languages was brought home and clear to me. So the engineers can give me a tutorial later on this afternoon. But I think this is very encouraging in that, as I mentioned, a number of people here in the room and in this town and overseas have been grappling with these issues for a couple decades. And so I think while there are some real new steps and critical, significant steps that are being taken by the QDR and the inclusion of climate and energy in such a significant way, this is really building on a foundation that is not starting from scratch, that has some models for, as we talked about, mill-to-mill work in this area, some of the analytical sides around accelerant to conflict and the threat multiplier aspect, and some of the energy gains as well as the energy vulnerabilities. And so I think Esther and Paul have really departed from that point, and I think part of the challenge now is to have the broader political discussion as well as the analytical discussion. Understand that this is a context where we have some work that we're building on, and we're not starting from scratch, and what might be suggested by those who might see it that way. So it is a very significant step. We very much appreciate you sharing both the process and the outcome and most importantly where we're going from here. Admiral, thank you for bringing in the comparative context and sharing what has been really the kind of leading role that the UK has played in these issues. And thank all of you for coming and sharing your insights as part of the process and here today. So please join me in thanking our panelists.